Thank you very much for inviting us tonight, this evening. Of course, you all know this cane, at least I hope you do. I'm Susan Hamson. I'm the University Archivist at Columbia, and it's a real privilege to be the archivist at one of the oldest schools in this country. And one of the happiest days that I had was when Bob sent me an email and said, you know, we used to have this tradition where we would pass the cane off from the outgoing editor to the incoming editor, and we'd like to get that tradition started. And I just about jumped out of my chair because I thought, oh my God, finally someone's interested in history. But as the archivist, every day I read the spec. I grab it, I miss it when it's not around in the summer. That's how I find out what's going on in campus, the latest thing that's going on, the latest issue. I find out what's going on in classifieds. I read it online. I share it on my Facebook page. I do all those things. So this cane for me is not just the importance for the spec that the tradition of the outgoing and incoming editor. It means that the alumni, current students, and people in the spec really have an interest in your history. And it's a momentum that's growing at Columbia because Columbia hasn't really been really great at keeping its archives. It's not a major secret, not a bad thing, but they could be doing a little better. And the spec, I think, really helps with that. First of all, digitizing the paper is really important. It's a really important historical resource. And in the Rare Book and Manuscript Library at the University Archives, we hit the spec all the time when we're doing reference. Some things are in the spec that we don't even have in our archives, and I think I brought a copy of the spec from '68 when Jerry Garcia and the band, the Grateful Dead, were performing on campus. We have no records of that. The only thing that we have is in the spec. It's a history of university development. If you want to see the arguments and the development of the core curriculum, of curriculum in general, you can read about those things in the spec. It's a connection to the history of New York City and the neighborhood, as you said. It's very much a neighborhood paper. That I have people in my building that check out the spec. Well, granted, there are a lot of Columbia people, but still. You learn a lot about student life and culture, and again, New York history. The history of Columbia is the history of New York City, the development of New York City, architecture, social life, cultural life, educational life. It's all there. And I want to let you know how it's been used by scholars thus far in a lot of interesting ways that you wouldn't normally think. We had a scholar in not too long ago that was actually interested in campus development and landscaping and architectural history. And you'd think that they'd go to Avery, but they really wanted to look at the spec and see. They came to us and said, is there a way that we can search for articles about campus development? No. Do you sort of know when the year that happened? No. We're just sort of looking generally. And then we were stymied, like we always are, thinking, well, there's no way to go to the microfilm and just push a button and say, do a keyword search. I want to look for landscaping. I want to look for building development on campus. It wasn't there. Now, they went through piece by piece by piece and triangulated through trustees' minutes and faculty notes and all these things and found some. But I couldn't help but think, wow, if we had this digitized, they would be able to search online, with their fuzzy slippers and their cup of coffee and find out all kinds of things about the campus. We've had people do pieces and scholarly reports and research on the history of advertising. The spec, looking at those old issues, seeing advertisements for canes and spats and top hats and gowns and God knows all kinds of things. It's really an interesting facet of New York City history, of academic life, of student life. What kinds of products were students using? Where were advertisers aiming their interests so that students would buy things? We have a researcher that just contacted me recently who's doing work on student dress codes. And they found that newspapers were actually really interested in this because, Columbia, and I don't know if you all are really aware of this, there used to be a group on campus called the Black Avengers. They were actually a pretty scary group. And they were sophomores who patrolled campus making sure that you didn't have freshmen doing any infringements. Carrying a cane at the wrong time of day, wearing spats in the wrong spot, smoking in the dorm, things like that. And wearing loud colors, plaid, bad. And a lot of that stuff you can actually find in the old editions of the spec and its predecessor at the Columbia. You can find these things. Protest and activism, always a huge topic, and gee, I don't know why they'd come to Columbia for that, but that's a huge topic, huge. And everyone from students, every year we host a high school group from Hartford, Connecticut that comes down, and they do, it's a class on American history after 1877, and they work on student protests, and they come and use our archives. And they want to look at the newspapers. Well, luckily, we actually have, the anniversary edition, we have the commemorative edition of the spec, and that's helpful. But that's then when you really know, it's like, we can actually say, here's the newspaper, here's the event where it happened, this is where you can look for this stuff. And with other events, you have to kind of know they happen to find them in the spec. And of course, the growth of the neighborhoods. Columbia hasn't always been in Morningside Heights. We were at 51st and Madison back in the day. And when you look at, and even before that in Park Place, but you can also see the development of the various neighborhoods that Columbia was in and how Columbia impacted those neighborhoods. So it's actually really interesting. So today when you use the Spectator, it's fragile. If we use some of the old issues, when I first came to Columbia in 2004, I opened up a cabinet where all the old specs were kept, and the smell just about drove me back about 10 feet. Because it was like, has there ever been this much acid-fraught paper in one place? And as an archivist, I'm usually pretty used to that smell, but that one really blew me back. But it was really, really fragile. And I worried, it's like, I know we have some of these things microfilm, but where are we missing? We couldn't actually use this. We couldn't use it as a thing. And as you're talking about the binders falling, turning in half and breaking as you're wrestling with them, sometimes you don't always win when you wrestle with the archives. You can't search the spec. With microfilm, you have to go through every issue, every page at a time. And in a modern research environment, scholars want to be able to get to something right away. There's missing issues. If you want to use the spec, you need to come to the library. You need to go to the spec offices to use it. There's interlibrary loan of microfilm, but how great would it be just to sit in your fuzzy slippers with your coffee and look through the spec? Or me at my desktop, fielding reference questions or working on exhibits or student life, of being able to go through the spec and say, hey, this actually broadens my knowledge of university history even more, that I have these other articles to add another resource. And if we look at tomorrow, we've got an index paper, as you say, coming into the 21st century. It's indexed, it's searchable, it's on your desktop. You can resource it very quickly. It's unlimited almost what you can do. I think, too, that the interest in this, it turns the corner and really ramps up again that history in Columbia, interest in Columbia history, which is so bloody important. Because we're better than Yale and Harvard, sorry, Steve. And, we can do a little bit more with our history. We have, with the spec being digitized, I believe and I know that we would have increased scholarly engagement because it's used so heavily now and not used enough. It's not mined enough. It would increase, we'd have respect among our peers. I mean, we have other universities, big and small, not necessarily Ivy, that are digitizing newspapers. It's important for us to be on that same par and to even set that example and lead going further. And it shows a real respect for the history of Columbia. Something that when I got that email, and I was more than happy to pull out this cane, and then working now with folks at the spec to make another silver band, and working with the folks in conservation that we could add female names to the cane now, and bring up this tradition that was ended in 1935. My 82-year-old mother was a kid then. That we can, reinvigorate the history and the interest in the history of Columbia is really, really exciting. So it's an important thing to do, and I'm sure you all know that. And Stephen is going to talk about the tech side because I had the